Hello there, this is Gary GERATHS, and this video focuses on how to paint calm water, ripples, and reflections. I will show a process and techniques of not only painting color, but also understanding how to paint those natural effects realistically. So here's my reference. I have painted at this spot several times and have made previous paintings, diagrams, and sketches that I will use in this video. I now want to show you the finished gouache painting. So during the drawing and painting step-by-step process, you can understand the editing, design, and layering of paint that will happen. So in this first diagram, I break down the wave patterns, rhythms, and shapes of the scene. Using the horizontal wave bands in perspective organizes the water surface into a flat plane. No matter how many directions of ripples you see, they follow that singular plane. You will notice that the wave gesture or action changes over the water surface, but as long as the pattern or rhythm is woven together, it will be believable. That is important as the current mass changes and pushes and pulls the volumes of water in different directions, thus shifting the reflective shapes and sizes as we will see in the next clip. These diagrams may seem a bit screwy, but remember, each ripple or wave, large or small, is a ridge of water. The thinner lines represent the pattern of the ripples. The longer green lines show the major pushing actions in the water, like a bulldozer pushing rows of dirt in a field. In the bottom half of the diagram, you can see me using my trusty chopstick to show the rhythm of the right-leaning waves moving to the right-hand section of the composition. At the top of the composition, the waves are moving to the foreground and show horizontal bands of ripples. At this point, I'm going to use a new organizing principle to break up the composition into shape design, dividing the color and value into different zones to organize the painting of the water. The first step is to simplify the lighter diffused light in the upper left. Though I can see lots of detail and texture, it's a foggy scene. I will paint that larger organic shape with just one major value and color and add a couple of other similar colors to it to suggest shifting light over the water's surface. Next, I will knock out the diagonal shapes of the slightly darker reflections. Remember, you are simplifying those shapes to understand how they will fit into the design, but also making it weird enough to make it interesting. If you notice, all the organic shapes follow a pattern of the curving blue lines like falling dominoes. Eventually, that large shape on the lower right will become a dark area of water reflecting the blue-gray clouds above. The main idea here in all this abstract thinking is to look at how all the big pieces fit together so the smaller details don't create visual noise or compositional distraction. So the last piece in the jigsaw puzzle is the dark shadow reflection shape coming off the pier and the boat. I've simplified the size and the complexity of the shadow shape and dark ripples to make sure that it works with the rest of the composition. From there, I will expand the dark ripples over the top of the lighter sea-colored underpainting. Now on to the last step before I start painting. Later, after I've blocked in all the major color groupings, I will add the very dark ripples reflected off the pier and the boat. As you can see from the reference photo, I have an ungodly amount of squiggly lines on the water's surface. So I must do a large amount of editing and creating interesting painted lines and shapes that reaffirm the structure of the pier and the boat and still move your eye around the composition. Remember, the ripples should be painted as if they were laying on top of the undulating waves. Those waves have the forms of speed bumps or of rounded ridges or hills. That's what all those short little arrows represent. So now it's on to the painting process. A couple important points to note is that though this is gouache, I paint in thin washes to build an underpainting, and the gouache has a tendency to go on light and dry darker. But also don't use too much white or your colors will appear weak and chalky. I start out with large lighter shapes in the background. The time is late morning and the sun is filtering through the thin fog. That's why I'm not painting with full-bodied saturated colors, but instead focusing on mixed grays. I'll save that for the next video. So now I thought I would show you how I come up with my color mixing. I won't go into my actual paint setup or palette at this point because that is outlined in previous videos of mine. Using the colors of the background I've already mixed, I add ultramarine blue and flame red with a bit of orange to the mix. This creates a gray, blue, violet that may be a bit dark, but goes on anyways just to see if it works out or not. Everyone creates their own process, but mine is that I tend to paint smaller shapes first and then come over the top with a big power paint blanket shape that sews everything together and unifies the mass. I will continue to soak up color from that large pool of paint and then overlap the lighter flat color with the darker reflective triangular colors that will stitch the two shapes together and break up the border between the two larger shapes. You might notice I pick up mostly small amounts of paint from the palette with the tip of my dagger brush. I'm mixing from that larger pool and then mixing smaller puddles of slightly different values of colors off to the side. This makes sure that my values are in harmony and don't become drastically high contrast. So I've already come to the conclusion that my base value of my paint is too dark for this area, so I'm going to mix lighter colors up to fill in and build up the larger mid-tone reflection shape. Note again that I'm leaving a section of the pool of the paint in the palette that has the original darker red-violet color ready off to the side just in case I need it later. Using more of a wet-on-wet watercolor technique, I'm going to start floating some whites into it so it doesn't create such sharp edges, but instead bleeds out into the wet paint that surrounds it. Now I'm moving on to that lighter patch of water I started earlier. That was more like a test strip to see how my high key values were appearing next to the other lighter shapes around it. I'm using artistic license now and want to apply a more bluish saturated color to the grays to bring more of the sky color into the lights and enhance the foreground. So at this point I'm going to spend some time and block in this light area. So at this point you may notice that I'm painting in some of the mid-tone colors into the lights and then adding some lights into the darks. Once again, the color shapes aren't so isolated and don't have a cut out look. So now that I have this witch's brew of cool colors on the composition, I mix up some turquoise green and turquoise blues and add some surface ripples across a bigger patch of blue violets. I realized that that whole lower section of the painting was just too dark and high contrast, so I took a big wet brush and mixed it all together so it flowed together with the other light shapes on both sides of it. Now I'm going to start moving the lighter, larger parts of the waves to the right-hand side of the composition. I am purposely making this section much lighter because it's just going to be an underpainting that I will be applying the darker ripples over later on in the process. Again, I'm not being a slave to the photograph. I'm using artistic license and changing what I see into what I can use. This technique goes back to those first diagrams in the video, and also simplifying the scene, knowing the details will go over the top and will not clash or distract from the color and value at this part of the painting. As I bring up this view of my colors and palette, you might notice I'm starting to mix into those light color areas from the start of the painting process. Using those colors from the left-hand side of the painting might help harmonize and unify the whole composition. Also, because of the weak light and foggy weather, I'm using some red, browns, and oranges as a complementary color to mix with the blues and the greens to make more neutral grades. Although I have black in my palette, I rarely use it because it deadens out the colors. The eye can pick up some extremely small changes in value, so I'm trying to paint in the lighter reflective sides of the waves, but also using those diagonal strokes of the red-violet paint to suggest ripples coming in from another direction. So at this point I'm going to reverse the process and put the lights over the midtones. I'm using a diagonal set of white ripple shapes in the same direction as the violet strokes, so that hopefully the rhythm of the similar marks carry you through from the left to the right part of the composition. Though it is hard to see in the reference photo, the shadow from the pier allows you to see through the water into the colorful rocks underneath. I purposely paint those in now, knowing that I will be painting the pier's dark reflection and shadow over it in the near future, and giving the suggestion of depth and light filtering through the water. So at this point I'm going to be knocking in the pier and the boat. Since this is a demonstration on water, I'm purposely going to be simplifying it in value and color as much as possible so it fits into the composition but doesn't distract from the focus of the demonstration. One important piece of equipment info, I switched over to a flat brush to paint in the straighter edges of the pier. That way I have a better brush control with the architectural objects. I'm somewhat satisfied with the general big picture underpainting setup, so I'm going to take you on a close-up tour of the painting so you might get a better idea of the true colors before I start the next step in the process. So you might notice I got a little unintended head start with the darker pier reflections. I painted in some patterns of ripples as a base and am overlying some larger darker shapes to pull those squiggly lines together. Notice that I'm applying the short reflective ripple lines in the same direction as those lighter but wider curving wave shapes. Once again, I work a little backwards by blocking in the ripple lines around the outside of the reflection first, and then using the dagger brush to fill in the shadow shapes later. But in the end, they connect together and work as a whole statement and don't fragment into pieces. As I paint, I move over the entire shadow shape and work up large to small dark value shapes. I want to build up a wide variety of shape and dark and warm colors to show the organized chaos of the water surface, but also use all the painted elements to move your eye around the composition. This is one of the main elements of the diagrams at the beginning of the video. If you understand what you are looking at, it's easier to edit and find the larger focal points and textures to make your painting more dynamic. Now I'm going to swing out and show how all the big painting shapes work in tandem before I put the next layer on. Though I can see some of the flaws and mistakes in the painting, I'm just going to move on and keep the flaws in the painting rather than waste time noodling around fixing little things. So I'm pulling up the palette again to show how all the color pools work in tandem. The dark puddle is the dark shadows in the pier. The browns and the greens are also the pier and the underwater rocks. At the right bottom are the boat colors. The last section is the dark areas of the foreground water, and the colors at the bottom are the lighter water in the background. Though it may look like a mess, note that I am mixing up different pools and then pulling colors out of those to mix elsewhere to harmonize the color composition. As for my actual colors, I arrange them from warms to cools, with the earth colors at the end. If you want to explore this more, I made a previous video on plein air painting and painting gear you can see on my channel. So now I'm laying in the wave and ripple textures, starting with a close-up of the background. If you refer back to the original diagrams I put up, you'll notice that I'm using perspective to lay in these different size strokes, demonstrating the texture and the different rhythm of the waves as they come into the pier. I'm using a series of short and long strokes, thick and thin, different marks, and then slightly curving the lines to show that the waves are moving into the darker mass in the foreground. I'm also using a combination of opaque and transparent brush strokes. That way what happens is as the paint dries, it'll work into the painting, but be very obvious and subtle, and other ones will overlap over the top of that and really show the action and movement of the wave patterns. Now I'm going to add the darker green turquoise wave halves over the top of what I've already painted, that way giving it a little bit more texture and perhaps even displaying a little bit more idea of the depth of the water in front of us. Again, you can see that I'm using the photograph for reference, but certainly not copying it. I'm using that artistic license for what best works with the composition and the texture and the movement that I want to portray. It is important that I'm trying to portray that sort of organic movement throughout the painting and getting your eye to move across from the left to the right where the pattern of the waves subtly move as well. So I bring my palette up again to show you how I basically mix my darks. So I got the ultramarine blue, mix that up, put a little bit of Windsor green in with it. You can see the mixture is getting darker, and then I'll mix a little bit of oranges and reds into it, the complementary color that again it'll knock the color down, but it'll make some really kind of luscious, nice deep grays. You might notice as I paint these darker wave shapes in that I go slightly more diagonal than the vertical curves of the underlying waves are. That's to give it a little bit more texture and show that the waves aren't one singular mass, but what happens is you get a layering effect where one fits over the top of the other and informs the other. It also makes a painting more active in the fact that your eye shifts back and forth between the underpainting and the darker, more dry brush or quicker stroked paint above. And now I'm going to add 2 layers over the top of that in darker colors. Now you can see that the paint is almost going on horizontal, but still keeping the same curvilinear as the other portion. That way it doesn't become distracting or jarring to the eye. Like I said before, all these waves, all these ripples, and all these forces are moving in tandem. Right now I'm going to be putting in some mid-tone blue-green shapes. That way what happens is that ties together the lighter parts of the painting in with the darker ones. It gives you an intermediate stepping stone in the painting. Also note that those shapes are softer at the edges too. Now I'm about to pull back and show the whole painting and bring in our reference photo. This way you can see the big picture at this point and see again the rhythm of the waves and the values and the colors as they move across the bottom of the composition. I'm about to bring back the palette in for another look. You can see at the bottom of the palette is mostly the boat and the pier and the rocks in the background, and the upper section is the water and the pattern of the ripples across the page. So I'm bringing up the painting again, and I'm going to start work on those ripples. I'm also bringing up the photo reference, and you can see that I'm not copying what's off the photograph because that would be insane to try to get all those little marks. So instead I'm interpreting them, and I'm mostly trying to get the idea of the rhythm of the ripples to help move your eye through the bottom part of the composition and over the top of the waves. I paint those little ripples in successive little marks, making sure that they all communicate together, and also making sure that they curve and undulate over the top of the larger waves that are in front of them or around things like the pier and the boat shapes as well. One large problem that I painted myself into, and you'll see me pointing it out with the brushes, those ripple stacks are too symmetrical. The distance between them are just too much the same. So to solve that problem in a quick manner, what I'll do is I'll break those lines up a little bit, sometimes painting one right into the other and connecting them together so they look more vibrant and a little bit more dynamic and even a little bit more chaotic. Another problem I've run into is that shadow shape off the back of the boat is too much of a lifeless blob. So what I'm doing is I'm going to add some more to the back of it, change that shape so it has a little bit more of a square back end, and even take some lighter white paint and then paint it into the shadow shape to kind of bury those holes into it. So at this point I'm going to pull back and show about 2/3 the painting and show you the effects of the ripples that I put on there, and how the strokes even in back of the pier move your eye forward, and dry brushing in the foreground gives a little bit more of the idea of the rougher texture that some of those ripples are applied to. Here's the entire composition again, and now what I'm putting in is sort of like green areas of horizontal ripples that hopefully tie in with the right hand side of the composition as well, but don't overtake the painting. So the last little accents I'll put in are things like the boat in the back, the reflective surface, little glints of sunlight off the waves, and other various focal points that move the eye around the painting. I'm bringing in some smaller bits of the painting to show you the difference between the vertical and horizontal strokes and marks and paint shapes. They work in concert together. This lower left-hand section of the painting shows you where the swirling smaller waves come together and make for sort of a rounded pattern. Not a lot of ripples on it, but larger strokes with, again, those little glistening pieces of light on some of the waves. The upper left section, where the background is, I'm reaffirming the perspective and then slowly curving the lines as they come more into the foreground and the action of the waves take over. I've also built the boat up a little bit more too, but not with a lot of detail. And last comes the upper right hand section of the painting where most of the shadow patterns are and the reflections are, and you can see those vertical pylons of the pier as they reflect vertically down into the water. That way it gives the idea of the larger forms that are attached to the water. And here's the final composition before I tear the painter's tape off to get a nice clean edge. And here's a completed painting at the end of the process. It's important to note that this was done in foggy weather, so the natural neutral grays are going to be dominant in the composition, but also make for a dynamic painting as well. So at the end of this video, I'd like to add some paintings that I've done throughout my travels. Some plein air paintings. Here's another painting done in Morro Bay, which is a more complex painting of the one that I just did. Two sketchbook paintings I did in late afternoon conditions when the warm light was prominent. The one on the left is a beaver pond in the eastern Sierras. The one on the right is a calm garden in eastern China. These were both done in noontime lighting conditions. I find that paint sketches can be very successful and very dynamic. It's a 20-minute painting done in the afternoon light in the mountains of Utah. Here's some fishing trawlers and a pleasure boat moored at a pier in Morro Bay, California. So thank you very much for watching, and feel free to look through my other videos on several subjects and share them with other artists. Please leave a comment and hit the like button, as well as subscribe, because more videos will be added in the future. Thank you again, and goodbye.